I gave that company years of my life, late nights, skipped holidays, endless pressure, and they replaced me in a heartbeat. Not because I failed, but because someone cheaper came along. No warning, no conversation, just a cold goodbye. They thought saving money meant cutting me out. But what if the person you quietly erase turns out to be the one who exposes everything? For a long time, I believed my replacement was something personal. I thought maybe I had done something wrong, or that I hadn't worked hard enough. It felt like a punch to the gut. But then, as I took a step back and reflected on everything, it became painfully clear. The truth was far more sinister than I had imagined. It was never about me. It was about money and control and a company culture that valued profit over people, regardless of the consequences. The CEO's decision to replace me with a younger and cheaper employee wasn't just a random act of nepotism, although that was bad enough. It was part of a growing pattern that I hadn't noticed at first. Over time, I began seeing a shift in how the company operated. Seasoned employees, people who had been there for years, people who had poured their time and energy into building the company, were quietly being let go. Some were replaced with interns, others with young hires who had little experience but came at a much lower cost. They didn't complain because they didn't know what to expect. They didn't ask for fair compensation because they didn't realize how undervalued they were. At first, it seemed like just a few isolated incidents, but as it happened more and more, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Senior employees who had been the backbone of the company for years were being edged out in favor of cheaper, less experienced labor. In meetings, their ideas were brushed aside, budgets were mysteriously slashed, and expectations grew higher as resources dwindled. It became clear that the company was choosing to prioritize cost-cutting over the well-being of its people. And then, one day, it was my turn. After years of dedication, after all the work I had put in, knowing the systems, the clients, and contributing to major growth milestones, I was told I was being replaced. Not with someone who had the same experience or background, but with someone who had never stepped foot in the office, the CEO's son. It wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a calculated strategy, a cost-cutting tactic masquerading as a family decision. But what became even clearer was that this wasn't just a one-off decision. It was part of a toxic culture that had been festering for a long time. People weren't seen as assets to be respected. They were simply numbers on a balance sheet. If you cost too much, if you pushed back even slightly, you were expendable. Your loyalty, your experience, your hard work, none of it mattered. If you didn't fit the new mold they were building, you were out. The way this company operated wasn't just unfair to me. It was hurting so many others too. I wasn't the first person to be let go in favor of cheaper alternatives, and I wouldn't be the last. The constant pressure to do more with less, the culture of burnout, the unspoken expectation that you had to sacrifice your well-being for the sake of the company, it all created a toxic environment. People were afraid to speak up because they knew the consequences. If you asked for time off or mentioned struggling, you were viewed as weak. Rest was punished. Silence was rewarded. I remember times when colleagues would come in sick, when they were visibly exhausted and on the edge of burnout, but they showed up anyway because the alternative was worse. The fear of being replaced, the fear of being discarded, was enough to make people keep quiet and push through. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me losing my job. This was about an entire culture of exploitation that had been thriving for years. My story was just one example in a long line of unfair treatment. And if I didn't speak up, the next person would face the same fate, maybe even worse. It became clear that I had to do something. My experience needed to mean something more. It wasn't just about me exposing what happened to me. It was about holding up a mirror to a company that had been getting away with this kind of mistreatment for far too long. It wasn't just about my personal loss. It was about creating change and making sure no one else had to go through the same thing. Have you ever realized that the place you were loyal to, the company you believed in, never truly saw your value? when you give so much of yourself, only to be tossed aside. It's a wake-up call that shakes you to your core. It's a lesson learned the hard way. At first, I seriously considered just walking away. I told myself that it wasn't worth the stress, that the company would move on, and I'd eventually find something better, somewhere that appreciated my value. But despite telling myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. It wasn't just about losing a job, it was how it happened. The way I was unceremoniously tossed aside like I didn't matter. The CEO didn't even bother to look me in the eye when he delivered the news. It felt like all my years of hard work, the long hours, the dedication, and sacrifice, had just been erased in a blink. The sense of betrayal was so deep, it wasn't something I could just move past or forget. It stayed with me, stuck in my mind, replaying over and over, gnawing at me, and making sleep a distant memory. I spent several nights lying awake, going over everything in my head. I replayed every meeting where I had gone above and beyond, every late night I had put in, every weekend I sacrificed, all because I believed in the work, believed in the company, and wanted to be part of something bigger than just a paycheck. All of that, and it still wasn't enough. To be replaced by someone who hadn't earned it, simply because he was the CEO's son, was beyond unfair. It was deeply insulting. It was like they were telling me, in no uncertain terms, that none of it mattered. My loyalty, my dedication, the work I had poured my soul into, it was all a joke to them. And that realization burned more than I could have imagined. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But beyond the anger, I felt something even stronger. A sense of responsibility. Because I wasn't the only one this had happened to. I remembered my coworker who had been quietly pushed out after she took medical leave, or the guy from marketing who got let go right after asking for a raise. There was a clear pattern here, one that no one wanted to talk about for fear of becoming the next target. Everyone, including me, had been too afraid to speak up, but something inside me shifted. I didn't want to stay silent anymore. I couldn't. What really pushed me over the edge was thinking about the people still working there, the ones who were still showing up every day, putting in long hours, being treated like machines with no regard for their well-being. I thought about how they must be constantly wondering if they were next in line to be thrown away. I couldn't just stand by and let that continue. I didn't want to see another person broken down by a system that didn't care, a system that saw people as nothing more than expendable resources. I had to do something, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been pushed aside, for everyone who had been silenced. But the decision to act wasn't an easy one. I knew there would be risks involved. Speaking out could make me look bitter or vengeful. It could make potential employers hesitant to hire me in the future. I might lose valuable connections, burn bridges, or close doors I hadn't even opened yet. The thought of that terrified me. I would be lying if I said there weren't moments when I almost backed out. There were times I questioned whether it was worth it, whether I should just forget it all and move on with my life. But then, in those quiet moments of doubt, it became clear to me, staying silent would be worse. If I didn't speak up, who would? If I just let this go, I'd be letting them win. I'd be telling them that what they were doing was okay, that it was fine to keep treating people this way. And that was something I just couldn't live with. It wasn't okay, and it never would be. So, I made the choice. I decided to speak out. But I didn't want this to be some emotional rant. I needed it to be clear, honest, and irrefutable. I began gathering everything I could to back up my story. Dates, conversations, emails, screenshots. Anything that would show the truth of what was really happening. I wasn't interested in taking anyone down. I just wanted people to understand what was really going on behind the closed doors of the company, and I knew exactly where I would share it. On LinkedIn. I wasn't acting out of rage or revenge. This wasn't about destroying anyone. It was about shining a light on the truth. It was time for the world to see the reality behind the polished facade. The truth had to come out, and I wasn't going to be afraid to let it. The day I decided I was going to expose the company, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just speak from emotion. I needed to be backed by facts, real proof. Otherwise, they'd brush me off as just another bitter ex-employee trying to make noise. I wasn't going to give them that chance. If I was going to speak up, I was going to do it right. That meant taking my time, being careful, and gathering everything I needed to tell the full story. I started going through my emails, months and months of communication with my team, with HR, with leadership. At first, I didn't think I'd find much, but the more I looked, the more I realized how many red flags had been there all along. I found emails where I had asked for support and was ignored. I found one where I had requested time off for health reasons and was met with a passive-aggressive response about pushing through. There were even messages praising me for my performance, just weeks before I was fired. It didn't make sense, and that's exactly why it mattered. Performance reviews were next. I had always kept copies, not thinking much of it back then. But now, they became some of my strongest proof. My reviews were glowing. I had met or exceeded every expectation. Managers had written about my dedication, my ability to lead, my reliability. So when I was let go without warning, it painted a clear picture that this wasn't about performance. It was about something else entirely. Then came the company communications, the ones that went out to the whole team, newsletters, memos, messages from the CEO bragging about cutting costs, streamlining teams, and rewarding those who made sacrifices. That last part stood out, because what they called sacrifice was actually burnout. It was unpaid overtime. It was never using vacation days. It was people crying in the bathroom during lunch breaks. And I wasn't the only one who noticed. Colleagues had spoken to me privately about it, too scared to go public, but their stories matched mine. I compiled everything. I created a folder and labeled every file, every screenshot. I made sure dates were clear. I cross-referenced messages and policies. I even saved Slack messages and meeting notes, anything that could help show the culture we were trapped in. I knew they might try to discredit me, so I prepared for that too. I didn't want there to be any holes in my story. It wasn't just about exposing that I was unfairly replaced. It was about showing the bigger picture, the way the company treated people like numbers, the way money was prioritized over mental health, the way loyalty meant nothing unless it was convenient for them. I included examples of others who had been mistreated, anonymized, of course, but their stories added weight to mine. This wasn't personal revenge. It was a pattern, a toxic, well-hidden pattern. Before posting anything, I asked myself, if this were put under a microscope, would it hold up? That was my test. Every piece of information I shared had to be factual, provable, and rooted in reality. I wasn't here to make wild accusations. I was here to tell the truth. And the truth didn't need to be exaggerated. It was already powerful on its own. Hitting post was one of the scariest things I've ever done. I stared at my screen for a long time before doing it, heart racing, hands slightly shaking. But after everything I had been through, the unfair firing, the gaslighting, the complete disregard for mental health, I knew I had to share the truth. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about giving a voice to every employee who had suffered in silence under a company that only cared about squeezing people dry and discarding them. Writing the post wasn't easy. I knew I had to strike the right tone. Honest but composed, emotional but grounded in facts. I started with my own story. I talked about being fired for taking a single mental health day after years of loyal service. I explained how I had always received glowing reviews, never had a performance issue, and still, the moment I prioritized my well-being, I was tossed aside like I didn't matter. Then I zoomed out. I wrote about the toxic work culture that encouraged burnout, glorified overworking, and treated rest like a weakness. I included some of the messages, policies, and examples I had gathered as proof. Not to attack, but to reveal the truth, clearly and boldly, I read the post at least 10 times before I finally clicked share. And for a brief moment, everything was quiet. I closed my laptop and went for a walk just to breathe. I honestly thought maybe a few people would see it, maybe a handful would comment, and that would be it. But I was wrong, so wrong. By the time I got back home, my phone had exploded. Notifications kept coming in nonstop. Likes, comments, connection requests, messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. The post didn't just get attention, it caught fire. Within hours, it had thousands of reactions and hundreds of shares. People from different industries, countries, and roles were commenting with their own experiences, echoing the same kind of toxic patterns I had described. It became clear that this wasn't just a company problem, it was a culture problem. What moved me the most, though, were the private messages. Former coworkers who had stayed quiet for fear of retaliation started writing to me. Some said they had gone through the exact same thing. Others thanked me for speaking up, saying it helped them feel less alone. Even people I didn't know, strangers from across the world, shared their stories of being fired for burnout, shamed for needing a break, or pressured into silence. Every message reminded me that I had done the right thing. And it wasn't just support from the outside. Internally, former employees of the company began adding their voices. They confirmed what I had said about the unrealistic expectations, the emotional toll, the fear of taking sick days, and how leadership constantly ignored feedback or concerns. It felt like a dam had broken. All the truth that had been bottled up for years was finally spilling out into the open. Once my LinkedIn post went viral, it didn't take long for the media to catch on. At first, it was just a few niche work culture blogs that picked it up. But soon, it was everywhere. Major outlets started writing about it, quoting parts of my post, and even reaching out to me for interviews. The story was too powerful to ignore. A CEO firing an employee for taking a single mental health day in a company that was already known for glorifying burnout. It hit a nerve with people. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about me anymore. It became a symbol of everything wrong with toxic workplaces today. News channels were running segments about it. Opinion pieces were being published. My inbox was flooded with reporters asking for comments. I was stunned. I never expected it to blow up like this, but deep down, I knew why it had. Because people were tired of being overworked, undervalued, and punished for being human. The CEO, Mark, tried to brush it off at first. He released a statement claiming I was disgruntled and misrepresenting the facts. But the more he spoke, the worse it got. People weren't buying it, especially when dozens of other former employees started commenting on the post and sharing their own horror stories. One after another, they backed up what I had said. Some even came forward with emails and internal documents that showed just how deep the toxic culture ran. The pressure on Mark mounted quickly. Sponsors began distancing themselves from the company. Some made public statements saying they were reviewing their partnerships. A few even pulled out entirely. Clients started canceling contracts. Investors weren't happy either. The company's stock, which had already been shaky, began to drop. Every new article, every viral tweet, chipped away at their reputation. Inside the company, chaos was brewing. Employees were quitting. HR was overwhelmed, and leadership had no real strategy to manage the crisis. They were in full damage control mode, but the damage had already been done. The public had made up its mind. No one wanted to be associated with a company that treated mental health like a joke. Eventually, Mark had no choice but to issue a public apology. But by that time, it was too little, too late. His words felt hollow. He talked about reevaluating policies and committing to change, but the trust was already broken. For years, they had ignored every red flag, silenced every concern, and punished employees who dared to ask for basic respect. Now, the world was watching, and there was no hiding behind a polished press release. The financial consequences kept piling up. The company's valuation dropped. Recruiters said candidates were rejecting job offers once they learned where they came from. It was like a slow unraveling, one that couldn't be stopped. The pressure on Mark didn't just build slowly, it hit like a tidal wave. Within weeks of my LinkedIn post going viral, his name was everywhere, but not in the way any CEO would want. What started as one post about being fired for taking a mental health day had grown into a public storm that Mark simply couldn't outrun. At first, he tried to keep his cool. He made a few vague public statements, brushing everything off as disgruntled exaggeration and claiming I was just trying to harm the company out of spite. But when thousands of people, many of them former employees, began stepping forward with their own stories, his defense fell apart fast. The toxic environment I had called out wasn't some isolated experience. It was the norm, and everyone who had worked under Mark knew it. Inside the company, panic started to set in. Clients were canceling contracts. Sponsors pulled their funding. Key executives began to quietly distance themselves. It became clear that this wasn't going to blow over. It was growing by the day. The media picked up the story, and every article that came out painted a clearer picture of how deep the company's problems ran under Mark's leadership. That's when the board stepped in. At first, they were quiet, hoping the situation would fix itself or fade away. But they couldn't ignore the numbers. Profits were slipping, the brand was getting hammered online, and the employees who remained were either quitting or publicly protesting leadership. The board held emergency meetings to discuss next steps. From what I later heard, there were heated debates behind closed doors. Some wanted to support Mark, to give him a chance to weather the storm. Others knew that keeping him in power would only drag the company down further. In the end, reality won. The board decided it was time for Mark to go. A few weeks after everything erupted, they issued a short, blunt statement. Mark was stepping down immediately. No long thank you note. No carefully crafted farewell. Just a sudden exit under pressure. It was clear that it wasn't voluntary. He had been pushed out. When I saw the announcement, I felt this strange mix of emotions. Relief mostly. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about accountability. I had been treated like I didn't matter, discarded for choosing to take care of my mental health. But the moment I saw that resignation, I knew I had made an impact. The CEO who once made me feel so small was now facing the consequences of his choices. He couldn't hide behind his title anymore. There was also a deep sense of justice. I wasn't the only one he had hurt. I had read messages from people who had worked under him and left completely burned out. Some talked about how they were shamed for asking for time off. Others said they were gaslighted for raising concerns. For years, Mark had built a culture based on fear, guilt, and non-stop pressure. His resignation didn't erase the damage, but it sent a clear message. Leaders like that don't get to hide when the truth comes out. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.